Most people never realize the moment they agreed to give their life away. There was no signature, no ceremony, no warning. It happened quietly, before you had words for it. You were born into a world already mid-conversation. Rules had been decided. Values had been ranked. Paths had been labeled successful or wasted. Before you could question any of it, you were already participating, and the most dangerous part, you were told this was freedom. From the moment you became aware of yourself, you were taught how to belong, what to admire, what to fear, what to chase. Approval came with conditions, love came with expectations, acceptance came with compliance, not because anyone was evil, but because the system works best when no one notices it. As a child, you learned quickly what earned praise and what invited correction. You learned when to speak and when silence was safer. You learned that curiosity had limits and that obedience felt rewarded. By the time you entered school, the lesson deepened. Sit still, raise your hand, repeat what you're told, follow the path laid out for you. You weren't trained to think. You were trained to perform understanding, to give the correct answer, not the honest one, to measure your worth by external markers, grades, rankings, validation, and slowly something subtle happened. You began to associate safety with conformity. This wasn't forced on you. It was taught gently, consistently, everywhere. As you grew older, the system expanded. Productivity replaced curiosity. Achievement replaced meaning. Identity became something you could summarize in a sentence. What do you do? Not who are you? Not what matters to you? What do you do? Your value became transactional. And here's the lie hiding underneath all of it, that your life belongs to the roles you play. Student, employee, consumer, follower. You were told that if you worked hard enough, followed the rules closely enough, and stayed within the lines, fulfillment would eventually arrive, later, after the sacrifice, after the approval. But for many people, that later never comes. Instead, they wake up one day with a quiet, unsettling feeling they can't explain. A sense that something is missing. Not success, not money, not comfort, something deeper. A feeling that they're living a life designed by someone else. This discomfort isn't weakness. It's awareness trying to break through conditioning. But the system is prepared for that too. When doubt appears, you're taught to turn inward. Not in reflection, but in blame. If you feel lost, you're told to hustle harder. If you feel empty, you're told to buy something. If you feel disconnected, you're told it's your fault. The question is never, is the structure wrong? The question becomes, what's wrong with me? This is how control becomes invisible. No chains, no guards, just beliefs quietly installed in the Adi mind. You begin to monitor yourself. You silence thoughts before they fully form. You abandon desires that don't fit the approved narrative, not because someone told you to, but because you learned it was safer. Over time, the voice inside you grows quieter, the voice that asks dangerous questions like, why am I chasing this? Who decided this mattered? Is this actually my life? Instead, a louder voice takes over, the voice of expectation, the voice of comparison, the voice that says, don't risk it, don't stand out, don't fall behind, and slowly, without realizing it, you stop living from the inside out. You begin living from the outside in. This is the invisible agreement most people never remember making. In exchange for belonging, you traded authenticity. In exchange for security, you traded freedom. In exchange for approval, you traded truth. And the most unsettling realization of all, no one forced you. You were trained to consent. This is why the system doesn't need to silence rebels anymore. It only needs to make them doubt themselves. Because when a person believes they are free, While never questioning the boundaries, they become easy to manage. They follow trends they didn't choose. They adopt values they never examined. They defend systems that quietly drain them, and they call it normal. But here's something rarely said out loud. If your life feels numb, rushed, or strangely hollow, if you feel disconnected despite being constantly stimulated, if you sense that your real self has been postponed indefinitely, that is not failure. That is the first crack in the illusion. Awareness always begins as discomfort, and discomfort is dangerous to systems built on obedience, because once you start noticing the cage, you can no longer unsee it. In the next session, we will go deeper. We'll explore how this invisible structure was refined over generations, how stories, language, media, and even the idea of success were shaped to keep people moving without asking where they're going. And most importantly, we'll uncover why those who sense this early often feel isolated, misunderstood, or out of place. Not because they're broken, but because they're beginning to wake up. Once you begin to sense the cage, the next question is unavoidable. How did it get here? This level of control didn't happen overnight. It wasn't designed by a single group or enforced by a single law. It evolved slowly, so slowly that most people never noticed it forming around them. The earliest systems of power relied on force. Kings ruled by threat. Empires expanded by violence. Obedience was demanded, not negotiated. Fear was visible and resistance was costly. But force has limits. A population ruled by fear eventually pushes back. Control through violence creates enemies. It requires constant enforcement. So power adapted. Instead of controlling bodies, it learned to shape beliefs. Instead of commanding obedience, it encouraged agreement. And instead of punishing dissent, it learned how to make dissent feel pointless. The most effective control system is not one that silences you. It's one that convinces you there's nothing worth saying. Over time, authority stopped presenting itself as domination and began presenting itself as guidance. Tradition, common sense. Just the way things are. People weren't told what to think. They were told what was reasonable to question. Everything outside that range was labeled unrealistic, immature, extreme, or dangerous. And slowly, that range narrowed. Stories played a critical role in this shift. Humans don't live by facts alone. We live by narratives. Stories tell us who matters, what success looks like, and which lives are worth admiring. So control embedded itself in stories. The story of success became narrow and repetitive. The story of happiness became standardized. The story of failure became moralized. Work harder, compete more, prove your worth. If you succeed, the system is fair. If you fail, the fault is yours. This story sounds empowering, but it carries a hidden message. Your circumstances are irrelevant. Your limits are personal failures. The structure itself is never questioned. This narrative doesn't just justify inequality, it protects it. And then came mass communication. For the first time in history, millions of people could be exposed to the same ideas, images, and values at the same time. Culture stopped being local, meaning stopped being personal. It became broadcast. Entertainment didn't just distract, it instructed. Advertising didn't just sell products, it sold identities. News didn't just inform, it framed reality. You weren't told what to believe. You were shown what everyone else believed. And humans are social creatures. Belonging feels like survival. So most people adjusted. They aligned their opinions with the dominant tone. They adopted the approved concerns. They learned which questions earned praise and which earned silence. Not consciously, instinctively. Over time, the illusion of choice replaced real freedom. You could choose between styles, brands, lifestyles, but never question the underlying assumptions that made those choices necessary. You could express yourself as long as it didn't disrupt the structure. You could rebel as long as rebellion could be monetized. You could criticize as long as it didn't challenge power directly. Even individuality became a product. Be different, but in predictable ways. Be authentic, but not inconvenient. Be bold, but not threatening. And here's where the cage becomes almost impossible to detect. You begin to identify with it. Your job becomes your identity. Your productivity becomes your worth. Your online persona becomes your voice. You measure your life using external metrics, followers, income, status, while ignoring internal signals of emptiness or misalignment. And when something feels wrong, you don't question the system. You question yourself. This is the brilliance of modern control. It doesn't need to watch you. You watch yourself. You censor your thoughts before they surface. You edit your personality to fit expectations. You abandon instincts that don't align with the approved path. Not because you're weak, because you were trained. Language itself became a tool. Harsh realities were softened with neutral words. Exploitation became opportunity. Surveillance became convenience. Disconnection became independence. When words lose their emotional weight, reality loses its urgency. And when urgency disappears, so does resistance. Anyone who refuses to play along is quickly labeled too intense, too negative, too radical, too sensitive. These labels are social warnings. They tell others, stay away from this way of thinking. So most people do. They return to the familiar, to the safe, to the numb. But some don't. Some people feel a growing tension they can't ignore. A sense that the life they're living isn't aligned with who they are. A feeling that the goals they're chasing don't belong to them. These people often feel isolated, not because they reject others, but because they can't unsee what they've seen. Once you realize the cage is psychological, not physical, escape stops being about location. It becomes about identity. And that's where the system tightens its grip. Because the final layer of control isn't external at all. It's internal. In the next session, we'll confront the most powerful mechanisms of all: fear, desire, and identity, and how they work together to keep you chasing, complying, and doubting yourself. This is where awareness turns into transformation, and where the illusion either collapses or tightens forever. The most powerful prison humanity has ever built does not have walls. It has beliefs. By the time most people sense something is wrong, the cage is already inside them. They carry it into relationships, into careers, into dreams they're afraid to fully admit. And that's why escape feels so difficult. Because you're not breaking out of a place. You're breaking out of an identity. Everything you were taught about desire, fear, and self-worth was designed to keep you moving, but never arriving. Always chasing, always improving, always becoming, but never being. Let's start with desire. Most people believe desire comes from within, that what they want reflects who they are. But look closer. From an early age, you were shown what a good life looks like, what success should resemble, what happiness is supposed to feel like. And slowly, your inner compass was replaced. You learned to want what was rewarded, to admire what was celebrated, to chase what others chased. This is why achievement rarely brings peace. The moment you reach one goal, another appears. The moment you acquire one thing, it loses its shine. Because desire shaped by the outside world is endless. It keeps you consuming, striving, comparing. And as long as you are chasing fulfillment externally, you remain controllable. Then there is fear. Fear is not just about danger, it's about loss. Loss of approval, loss of status, loss of belonging. You were taught, often without words, that stepping outside expectations comes with consequences. That being different risks isolation, that choosing your own path invites judgment, so you hesitate. You soften your truth, you postpone your instincts. You delay becoming who you know you are. Fear doesn't have to stop you directly. It only has to make you doubt yourself long enough for habit to take over. And over time, doubt becomes identity. Which brings us to the deepest layer of all, who you believe you are. Most people mistake their conditioning for their personality. They say, I'm just not that type of person. I'm not confident. I'm not creative. I'm not a risk taker. But these aren't truths. They are conclusions drawn inside a controlled environment. You were given roles before you could question them, labels before you could define yourself, expectations before you could choose freely, and eventually you accepted them, not because they were accurate, but because they were familiar. This is the final trick of the system. It convinces you that your limitations are natural, that your fears are rational, that your dissatisfaction is normal, that your silence is maturity. But deep down, something resists. A quiet tension, a persistent sense of misalignment, a feeling that the life you're living doesn't fully belong to you. This isn't confusion, it's remembrance. The memory of who you were before you learned to shrink. Freedom doesn't begin with rebellion. It begins with clarity, with the willingness to ask uncomfortable questions. Why do I want this? Who benefits from this belief? What part of me did I silence to fit in? Awakening isn't loud, it's subtle. It happens when you stop chasing approval, when you stop performing identity, when you stop asking permission to exist as you are. This doesn't mean rejecting society. It means refusing to let society define your inner life. You still work, you still participate, but you no longer confuse the game with reality. You stop mistaking roles for self. You stop mistaking productivity for purpose. You stop mistaking survival for living, and something changes. The noise quiets. The urgency fades. The need to prove dissolves. You begin making choices from alignment instead of fear. And that's when the system loses its grip. Because a person who no longer needs validation cannot be easily controlled. A person who knows themselves cannot be easily manipulated. A person who has reclaimed their inner authority cannot be managed by illusion. This is why awakening is discouraged. Not because it's dangerous to society, but because it's dangerous to systems built on unconscious compliance. Once you see clearly, you can still play the game, but it no longer owns you. You move deliberately. You choose consciously. You live from the inside out. And here's the truth most people never hear. Freedom is not something you earn. It's something you remember. You were never broken. You were never behind. You were never inadequate. You were trained to forget your own power. And the moment you stop believing the lie that you are small, limited, and dependent, the illusion collapses. Quietly, permanently. The cage doesn't shatter, it dissolves because it was never real to begin with.